Hey, Assalamu alaikum. Going back to what I was thinking about the NHS, is the NHS is amazing, it's brilliant, right? But there's obviously a few nuances, a few areas that actually we forget about, or we haven't really incorporated that in, right? Especially as a Muslim, from a Dini perspective, there are many areas that actually aren't incorporated inside of mainstream health. So if I kind of give you an example, so generally in the NHS, we have a few actually, like, I think two main branches generally. We have like physical health, and so we have everything under that. And then we have like a mental health branch, and then there's like loads of things under that, right? And so that's kind of how we see, um, you know, that's how we see health. It's either physical health or it's mental health. And obviously, they both do overlap in some respect. But there are different kind of departments and factions inside and underneath all of those, and they all branch out into various areas. Now, one thing as a Muslim that we know, right, that does not is not part of the NHS or is not part of mainstream healthcare is spiritual health, right? It's not part of any form of mainstream healthcare that we have. So that's one very fundamental thing that we don't cover. And what that proves is that no matter how amazing the NHS and mainstream health might be, the fact of the matter is it doesn't incorporate everything, right? And so there are areas that are outside of that we then have a responsibility to look into, to explore, to learn, to understand, and to implement for our own health. So, for example, so let's look at spiritual health then, right? So, spiritual health, in fact, is basically your connection, your heart, your soul connection with Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, right? And we know that when you have a strong and firm connection, um, you feel at peace, you have a sense of purpose, you have a sense of fulfillment, and then that is obviously a feeling, but actually you have to understand how that affects your physiology, because what happens is that your cells and your brain, your mind, your body is kind of at a calmer state. So you're not in this kind of stress mode all the time, or in the cellular stress, but in fact actually there's a calm and serenity in your body. And so if you are suffering from chronic conditions, you're more likely to have probably less spikes and less inflammations, and you'll probably be a little bit more stable and things, because of the fact that the peace and serenity that you feel with your deen and with your connection to Allah is actually like motivating, inspiring, and fueling and nourishing your heart, your mind, your body. And so it's just in a better optimized state overall, right? So we know that then spiritual health can actually directly affect our physiology, right? And even other areas. So, for example, as a Muslim, we all have heard of and come across of, um, you know, uh, Ain, so another, or the bad eye, evil eye kind of thing, or black magic and sihr and all of these, like jinn and all of these areas. Now we know that if we had those and we came to a doctor in the mainstream NHS and we said, look, I think I've got a jinn, um, they'd probably just go ahead and direct you to mental health or something, because it's just not part of it's just not part of mainstream health, right? So it's just not included in that. And we know that people who are affected by these things do have, it's not just spiritual, but it affects you emotional level, it affects you on a mental level, it affects you on a physical level, right? So you get symptoms, whether it's like shaking, lack of sleep, or whatever it might be, but you get symptoms of it. And so we have to then understand that if you then kind of get these symptoms, how are you going about diagnosing it? Right? And so a normal doctor won't do that. So we know this. We know that mainstream health doesn't actually involve everything, and that's okay. Science is something that is advancing, and things like gene and stuff is just something that is just advanced, so advanced that science isn't there yet. And science is a constant evolving learning process, right? So it's just not there yet. But inshallah, it will be one day. So that's kind of like proof. We know that mainstream health doesn't cover everything, right? And so this is where I want to make a point now, right? There is one area of health that mainstream health has kind of just, it's just kind of gone over the head, and that is emotional health. And unfortunately, emotional health is something that has kind of been, you have mental health, and emotional health has just been put under there, and it's kind of just been mixed together. It's not really seen as an independent area when actually it deserves its own independent department itself. Um, and just to highlight the difference between mental health and emotional health, right? So, mental health is obviously more to do with the actual mind itself, in terms of what you think, in terms of the neurotransmitters that are released and that are floating around the brain, in terms of the chemicals or the hormones that are released from the glands that we have in our brain, right? And how that affects physiology. So we have things like dopamine, serotonin, all of these types of hormones that we talk about that kind of influence your mood, they influence your physiology, and etc. and etc. Right? But emotional health is different because emotional health is how we feel about something, right? And how our responses are. So things like anger, fear, um, sadness, grief, all of these actually feelings that we hold, that we feel really deeply. And we know that they kind of affect our physiology because sometimes when we're angry, we might get red in the face and, our face will go like, oh, you know, or if we're sad and we're grieving, then we might cry. And so there's obviously a very direct relationship between having an emotion and how our body responds to that. But what we don't realize is actually how we feel has to go to the brain first. So it starts off with how we feel in our heart, and then that actually goes to the brain, and in the brain, then it releases certain hormones, neurotransmitters, all of those things areas, and that elicits the physiological response, right? So it's not just mentally, these things are being released, and they might do just by thought or things like that, but how we feel as well elicits actions to happen in the brain, which then affects our body, right? And so yeah, we have to see that as a separate thing because that is kind of a root source of how things are then happening inside our brain, which are creating our bodies to, elicit response. And let me just give you an example of that, right? Because I know I'm explaining a lot of theory type of stuff. So I want to give you a practical example. So let's give an example of, a child or an adult even. There are cases where in extreme fear, when they're really, really scared of something, and you see something shivering and shaking, and they're really, really scared. One really common thing we see, a response we see in the body, is that people that are really, really scared tend to urinate themselves. And we see this in movies, and we see this actually in children as well, like, even adults. And people when they're really scared, they wee themselves. And that's because the feeling of fear has obviously caused some kind of neurotransmitter to be released in the brain, hormones to be released, and it's gone to the kidney area and it's affected the kidney directly, that you've gone and weed yourself, right? So there's 2 points here I want to share. So the point number one is the fact that emotions we feel directly affect how our body responds, and that means that if we're feeling like tummy ache, if we're feeling migraines, if we're feeling pain, if we're feeling all of these other symptoms that are like very external, there is a possibility that it could be from feeling something, right? It could be from an emotion. And it could be something you're aware of at the time, or it could just be subconscious things that you felt before, but you've just forgotten about and you've just suppressed it, right? So that's point number one, that emotions do affect your body. And point number two, I want to make, just based on that example of someone of that kidney example, is the fact that certain feelings and certain emotions affect certain organs. So different things that you feel affect different areas of the body. And I've given you an example of fear. Let's give you an example of nerves. You know, when you have a driving test or you have like an exam coming up, say you're sitting an exam at school, right? You get butterflies. Um, or even like if you're going up a roller coaster and you're nervous, right? You get butterflies in your stomach, right? And so can you imagine you don't get weird feeling in like your arms or anywhere else. It happens in your stomach. So there must be a relationship of how the feeling that you're feeling is affecting a certain organ. And so that shows that different areas in your body where you're feeling something could be as a result of a very specific or emotion, a very specific thing that you've gone through and a feeling that you've experienced of that. Okay, so that's just what I wanted to share. And actually, one more thing before I go, I wanted to share is an example of you have these uh, e- um, examples of elderly people. And you see these elderly couples that have been married for 40, 50, 60 years, right? And as soon as one spouse passes away, the other spouse feels so isolated. They feel there's so much grief, there's so much loss. And they come to a point where they've got nothing left to live for. And eventually, what happens is, and you see this all the time, is their heart just shuts down. And it happens as soon as like one spouse passes away. Is a lot of the times it doesn't take that long for the other spouse to pass away because they've just now felt like, you know what, that's it. Like, I'm now separated from my spouse. I've got nothing left to live for. Or I've just, my heart is just given up now. My heart is just gone. And the heart feels that and the heart then shuts down. Can you understand how powerful that is? And this is not a theory thing. Like there are actually lots of scientific papers and stuff. If you go into it, look into it, there are a lot of like research into this, and people don't really understand why there's so much strain on the heart and the heart just shuts down. Um, but it shows the fact how emotions can affect us so much, and it just shows how it can affect us so much that your body can stop working. How crazy, how magnitude is huge, is huge. That insight into what we feel can affect us so much that the body can shut down because of it. Can you understand now the magnitude of emotional health? Because it's not given the recognition, the awareness that it deserves. Because if it can cause people to die, then it's a conversation we need to start having, and it's a conversation we all need to have with ourselves and with other people. And do you know why? Because we are all human beings, and that means we are emotional beings. It's part of our fitra, is how we have been created, which means we all go through emotions. We all go through happiness, sadness, grief, fear, anger, all sorts of things, right? We go through all of it, and therefore we all need help. We all need to work through these things, right? Because we have a duty unto ourselves to look after ourselves. And emotional health is something that has not been really talked about or discussed, and it's not given the pedestal, I guess, that it requires. But we need to start changing that. So I want you to think about what kind of experiences or feelings that you felt, whether it's now or whether it's in the past. If you felt like there's experiences in your past that have kind of really etched in your mind.